Audience discretion is advised due to potentially distressing and sensitive material. Francine Elfson was born on July 21, 1953, to parents Leon and Sylvia Elfson. She had two younger siblings, a brother Joel and a sister Deborah. Francine and Joel, just like many brothers and sisters, had a conflictual relationship while she was very protective of her baby sister. As a child and adult, Francine spent a lot of time at the hospital where the doctors did whatever they could to correct her spine so she could walk and breathe on her own. She suffered from kyphoscoliosis. She got her master's degree in education from Fordham University and pursued her dream of becoming a special education teacher. She taught at a daycare center for handicapped children in New York and absolutely loved her job and her kids. This was the job she was working for her whole life. She was a shy personality and was mostly introverted. She didn't do well in social scenes. She stood at less than 5 feet tall and weighed 80 pounds. Francine lived with her parents on the 4th floor of Helen Parkway houses in the Bronx. She was 26 and lived a relatively normal and quiet life. They were a middle-income family and had jobs to go to. It was October 12, 1979, a Friday. It was a full, sunny day in New York. She left her parents' house to go to work at 6:30 a.m. like always. At around 3 p.m., there's a knock on the door and Francine's mother opens the door to see one of their neighbors who holds out Francine's wallet and tells Sylvia, Francine's mother, that his son had found it between the 3rd and 4th floor stairwell before going to school at around 8:20 and hadn't had the chance to bring it over till lunchtime when he got out of school. Sylvia thanks the neighbor and closes the door. She thinks Francine must be looking for her wallet, so she decides to call her at work, since there weren't any cell phones back then, and let her know that she's got her wallet. When she calls the daycare center and asks to speak with her daughter, she's told that Francine never showed up to work that day. Panicked, she starts searching the apartment building with a neighbor and her youngest daughter, thinking that something may have happened to her daughter because of her condition. They search every floor. On the 6th and last floor of the building, they come face to face with the most horrific scene. A mother's worst fear, a scene that would leave anyone scarred and traumatized for life. There she was, Francine, her eldest daughter, spread-eagled, mutilated, her underpants pulled over her head to cover her face. She was nude, tied around her wrists and ankles with her own belt and stockings. Her nipples had been cut off and placed on her chest. There were bite marks on her inner thighs and around her knees. There were also shallow lacerations on her body. Her umbrella and pen had been forced into her vagina, and her comb was in her pubic hair. After the authorities were called and showed up at the scene, it was revealed that her cause of death was ligature strangulation. She'd been raped and beaten. Her jaw, nose, and cheeks were fractured and her teeth had loosened as the result of the severe beating. The cuts on her body were made with a small penknife. The investigators also found that the scene had a ritualistic nature to it. Her earrings were placed symmetrically on either side of her head. The killer had left messages for the investigators on Francine's body. He scrawled on her thigh, "Quote, you can stop me," and on her stomach the words, quote, "fuck you," to taunt the police. There were traces of semen on her body, but since there was no forensic DNA analysis at the time, its existence didn't help much. The interesting thing was that there were no skin fragments or anything under her fingernails, and there were no defensive wounds, which suggested that there was never a struggle. The killer had defecated near her body and covered it with Francine's clothes. Again, no DNA forensics, so not much help. The only piece of evidence found at the scene was a single negroid hair which was found during the autopsy. In the aftermath of the slaying, the residents of the apartment building in the Bronx lost it. The males stalked the halls of the building while being openly armed, looking for any kind of suspicious activity. One resident said, quote, "We're just looking for somebody doing something stupid, like messing with any of the girls. If it's the wrong guy, it's the wrong guy. We'll beat the hell out of him." End quote. Women moved in groups carrying instruments to defend themselves if anything went wrong. A hammer, a can of mace, and they showed them to one another nervously. The neighbors organized a mass meeting demanding security to be improved, realizing there was no security if something like this could happen early in the morning to a resident. Add to this the fact that the body was not discovered for almost 9 to 10 hours. At least 20 detectives and 20 uniformed officers were in the area after the attack and for days afterwards. Everyone was worried that this would not be the last they see of this murderer. The police even concluded that this was most probably his very first attack, but it for sure would not be his last if he was not caught. The crime was so heinous that the police set up a special number to receive tips and information. The police estimated that the attack had lasted 30 to 45 minutes. There were no suspects in the beginning of the investigation, and the only clue they had was the single hair found on the victim's body, so they started looking for a black suspect. The main suspect the investigators had was an African American janitor who had left his job at the building but had never returned his keys. Another suspect was the victim's brother and one of his friends, who were cleared right away. Next, the investigators said they believed that since her brother and his friends were selling drugs, which they didn't even smoke, Francine was killed as a result of a drug deal gone wrong as a warning to her brother and his gang. After examining the scene, homicide detectives determined that Francine was initially attacked while walking down the stairs and was beaten unconscious and carried to the roof landing. The autopsy indicated that she wasn't raped. After a month of investigation and interviewing every single resident of the apartment building, more than 200 potential witnesses and suspects, the case started going cold. And so, even though the police didn't believe this would yield anything specific, they decided to contact the FBI for further investigation to take place. Enter John Douglas and the Behavioral Unit. After reviewing the files, reports, autopsy report, and crime scene photos, Douglas provided a description of their killer. He suggested the police look for, quote, "an average-looking white male between the ages of 25 and 35, probably right around 30, who would be disheveled in appearance, unemployed, and mainly nocturnal, live within half a mile of the building with his parents or older female relative, be single and have no relationship with women and no close friends, be a high school or college dropout with no military experience, have low self-esteem and not own a car or hold a driver's license, who was currently or had been in a mental institution taking prescription medication, had attempted suicide by strangulation or asphyxia, was not a drug or alcohol abuser, and who would have a large collection of bondage and S&M pornography," end quote. He also added that, quote, "You don't have to go far for this killer. You've already talked to this guy," end quote. Spoiler alert, the killer was in the suggested age range. He was a high school dropout, he was unemployed and had a history of mental disability, and he was undergoing treatment in a nearby hospital. But let me tell you how John Douglas came to provide this profile. Francine, as said by her parents, sometimes took the elevator and sometimes took the stairs. So it's not as if the murderer could be there every day at 6:30 to see when she took the stairs to attack. If he did, then people would have started to notice him, and he would be the first person to be interviewed after the crime. So this indicated that this was a crime of opportunity rather than an organized, well-planned crime. Another factor that contributed to this belief was that the killer had brought nothing but a penknife to the crime scene, and everything used on Francine belonged to her, which again shows that he didn't stalk Francine or have the intention to commit the crime on that specific day. This means that he must have been there for another reason. A. He could be a resident. B. He could be working there, maybe a mailman or something, but that means someone must have noticed his presence. Or C. He could have a relative in the building, which again leads us to believe that he must have known his surroundings really well. And that is why he knew exactly where to take Francine after knocking her unconscious, somewhere no one would be that early in the morning, or maybe for hours or even days. Since none of the individuals who were interviewed reported anything suspicious going on that day, he must have fit in. And this is probably the reason why Francine didn't scream or struggle. She must have seen him around. Mr. Douglas, despite being informed about the black hair found on the body, stated that they were dealing with a white murderer because this type of crime is rarely seen cross racial lines. In addition, he said in his book Mindhunter that he'd, quote, seldom seen this kind of mutilation from a black subject, end quote. The fact that this was a high-risk crime and a low-risk victim showed that this was a disorganized crime. So there was a small chance that he'd had any kind of military experience and would probably be a high school or college dropout. As I said earlier, despite what had been suggested initially, the autopsy report showed that there was no rape, but semen had been found on the body, and he'd done all this to an unconscious woman who was very small in size, and he could have taken her even if she was conscious. This all indicates that they were looking for a quote, insecure, sexually immature, and inadequate individual, end quote. The subject was also, as can be concluded from the crime scene, into bondage sexual fantasy that had built up over the years and was getting out of control, so he was trying to dominate and degrade her body as much as possible, like leaving her naked, pulling her underpants over her face, not to cover it as a sign of remorse, but to degrade her even more by inserting her umbrella and pen into her vagina. In addition, the fact that he was hanging around the building at 6:30 a.m. while everyone else was starting their day showed that he was unemployed or didn't have a full-time job, so he wouldn't be able to live on his own either, which hints at the fact that he's living with a parent or an elderly relative. He wouldn't have a car because he wouldn't be able to afford one, which means that he either lived at the building or took public transportation to get there, which would leave him at a range of half a mile from the apartment building. And the fact that the scene had turned out to be of a ritualistic nature, the earrings, the severed nipples, the positioning of the body, led Douglas to believe that the individual had deep psychological and psychiatric problems and was on meds. After the profile was revealed, the police went back to work and cut their suspect list down to 22, and finally to only one, Carmen Calabro. He was a 30-year-old white male living with his father in the building. In fact, he was Francine's next-door neighbor. He was an unemployed actor, was unmarried, a high school dropout, no military experience, and had a mountain of bondage and S&M pornography. He was also an inpatient resident at a local mental hospital and was diagnosed with depression and was undergoing treatment. But as it turns out, he was absent without leave at the time the crime took place and had simply walked out the evening before the murder of Francine Elfson. As for the black hair found on the body, well, it turns out the body bag that Francine was transported in was not well cleaned before use, and the hair belonged to the previous victim that was placed in the body bag. And the fact that Calabro had defecated near the body was interpreted as part of his ritual fantasy or a sign of contempt for the victim or women in general. Another reason could have been nerves, and this is not an uncommon occurrence. Of course, John Douglas thought that this could have resulted from the use of the medication Calabro was on. All this took 13 months. Now remember the bite marks left on Francine's body? The police asked for dental impressions and they matched Calabro's. But interestingly, he had his teeth removed during the appeals process to avoid prosecution. A profile expert, Mr. Godwin, defines this kind of serial killer as objective effective. They fail to see that their victims are human beings and treat them as sole objects. They spend a long time with their victim's body and kill them slowly, sadistically, and torturously, and degrade them as far as their imagination can take them. And this is done to bring the victim under their power. The binding. Carmen Calabro was sentenced to only 25 years in prison for his crime. In a webpage dedicated to Francine's memory, her brother Joel writes about the aftermath of her death. Her father Leon, who lived all his life with pride, died of a broken heart, not ever letting his feelings show, just his anger. Her mother, after years of cutting herself from the world, died of a stroke. Debbie, her younger sister, went on to complete her education just like Fran, get married and have kids. But something died in her along with her sister. She was always indifferent. Joel, just like his dad, hid his feelings from the world, but he too deteriorated over the years. He lives in the past and struggles with depression. In his words, on that fateful day, he lost his sister, but 4 other people died right alongside her. Please leave any theories or comments you might have for us down below. We're really interested to know what you think about this case.